Hello, welcome to this book chat of the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology. My name is Jovan Maud, I'm an editor here at the Institute, and today we're discussing this book, Traces of Violence, Writing the Disaster in Paris, France. We've been joined by the authors of the book, Robert Desjarlais, who's Professor of Anthropology at Sarah Lawrence College in the US, and Khalil Habrih, who is a doctoral student at the University of Ottawa. And also joining us today to discuss the book is Ursula Rao, Director here at the Institute and Head of the Department, the Anthropology of Politics and Governance. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So the book we're discussing today, Traces of Violence, centres on the aftermath of the terrorist attacks in Paris in 2015 committed by the Islamic State. And it sets out to trace the ramifications of this violence in different forms. So it's an interesting book, a co-authored and dialogical book. Maybe could I ask each of you, first of all, to tell us how this book actually came to be? Robert?
Sure, yeah. It's a good question because we were both doing research in Paris at that time in 2015 and on, and we didn't actually know of each other at first. And I was doing research on the particular sites where these violent attacks had happened and engaged in this very kind of quiet ethnographic research. And a good 9 months after I started doing this research, I presented in a seminar at a university in Paris, and Khalil was attending that seminar. And, it was a good seminar, it worked well, and Khalil had put up his hand toward the end of the session and raised some very good questions. And we then exchanged emails, and we met a few weeks later, and we went for this long walk in some neighborhoods in North Paris. And we had a lot to talk about and to sort of, compare notes with, and we thought it would just be a kind of collegial encounter and a conversation, but it eventually built into a collaborative work. I had already written several chapters of the book, first drafts, and so we developed a method where we continued with the writing, working through time, and Khalil actually developed this concept of the interruption. So each chapter has the main text, and it's followed by an interruption, where the other author of the book interrupts that first text, and we found that a very kind of fruitful generative process in that sense.
Okay, thanks. And Khalil, how was it for you coming into this book and working with an already well-established professor in anthropology?
Well, I'd moved to Paris in 2015, so before the attacks, and I had already set out to work on policing in a specific neighborhood, the neighborhood I'd moved into, the Goutte d'Or in Paris. And so when I asked my question to Robert during that seminar, well, I asked the question first because I had to write a piece about his work in order to pass that class. And so I thought it would be a sort of collegial encounter, a one-off, and so we went on this walk together. We engaged in an interesting discussion, and Robert suggested that he integrate the validation paper that I wrote for that course into the book as a sort of annex, and then sort of quite spontaneously, he asked me to write more or to read and give feedback. And it started through, I think, an initial email where I wrote some feedback about some ideas. And then he said, well, that do some great writing for the book. You should develop that into something more formal. And to actually answer your question, I think it was quite intimidating. I was a very young student doing some very sensitive field work. With little to no direction at the time, and so it felt very experimental to me. But Robert was sort of quite confident that there was material that was worth, the work, worth the effort, and so from there it started.
Okay. Khalil, can I ask you something about this? I love the idea of a book which is developed in a dialogue. And what intrigued me was the way your own voice and Robert's voice were intact and remained uniquely visible through the writing. But at the same time, I could see how both of you had talked and learned. Could you maybe explain a little bit more how much your writing was shaped by this conversation, and how much it was more a self-discovery, where you said, I am trying to figure out what I had to say about the city?
Well, yeah, it's a very good question and a hard one to answer, I think, because it's a very unusual situation to find yourself in as a student, to be given the time and the serious attention to write in a way that moves from the position of a student to the position of a scholar. And so this whole experience of writing with Robert was a form of training. I had to figure out what my voice was. I had to write a lot of different drafts, and my thought is that by the end of the project, with the reviewers and through the publishing phase, I was able to not only learn how to exploit concepts and not only learn about anthropology, because I was in sociology at the time, and so I was moving through disciplines, but I was also learning how to write. And having Robert Desjarlais as an interlocutor was both daunting because of the sort of seamless and writerly tone that he has, but was also a great opportunity for me to measure myself against a more established writer and to interact with the concepts of authority and authorization that come with authorship.
So, Robert, did you feel that your writing was influenced by this conversation?
Yes, definitely. I think particularly in terms of the subject matter and the knowledge that Khalil could bring to the research. And I knew I had a kind of partial understanding of what was going on in Paris. And I was doing research in the 10th arrondissement, but it was very much in the center of Paris politically and culturally. And it was a very welcome interruption when Khalil and I started to talk with each other to sort of bring out these other considerations within the space of Paris. And so, we really sort of worked on the writing together, and I was informed by that. But I think particularly Khalil's, the depth of the knowledge that they could bring to the conversation in our writing together, and this dialogic constructive process that we developed together through it. So it was very, informative for me. And there's a concept that we use at the beginning of the book. We call it an emergence of understanding. So there's a kind of implicit narrative through the whole book that we both come to understand different things through the process of writing, through the process of research, and that's tracked within the text itself. And I think it's different for each of us. For me, it was to understand better these histories of violence that pattern life and death in Paris. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by your phenomenological method. So I would like to push you a little further on,
Sure.
Talking about, your part of the writing. And what struck me about it was the austerity with which you read the material affordances of the city and what I guess were the traces of violence through both the impact these spaces, the atmosphere had on you, but also just casually, almost like a flaneur. I don't know whether you like this metaphor. I would like you to comment on this. Catching some conversations, thinking about them deeply. I was hesitant with flaneur because it suggests, a very, something very superficial, which I think is absolutely not what you're doing. I mean, you're listening in, you are there, you're feeling it on your body. It's flesh and stone. Tell us a little bit more about why you chose this method and what kind of ethnography is that, or what kind of perspective are you communicating through this way of interrogating your environment?
Exactly right. Yeah, and I think it's very much tied to this approach to fieldwork at the time of a very low key, non-intrusive kind of ethnographic presence in these sites of violence. I didn't want to interview people directly. I didn't want to interview people who had been affected directly by the violence and interrogate their trauma or their wounding. And so very much a kind of low-key participating in everyday life, going to these cafes and and paying attention. And it's true that, there is this allusion to the flaneur, but I think a flaneur is very much this kind of leisure class who has time to go on these strolls and take in the spectacle of the city. And I would constantly be revisiting these places and a kind of in-depth reflection on them. But you're right, that very much on the materiality of these places, the play of traces and absences, the atmospherics of a particular neighborhood or even a street corner. And through all that, creating a kind of composition, an ethnographic composition of life in these particular places in Paris and the way that these legacies of violence have impacted lives there. So I think it is a kind of distinctive method. It ties into this kind of attentive sensorial phenomenological approach that pays attention to materiality. There are conversations that I quote in the book, but these came about spontaneously rather than part of an ethnographic method in that respect. And it shifts through time too within the book, because there is a more in-depth engagement later in the passages that I have written on the questions of the archives and these histories of violence. There's a passage toward the end of the book where I talk about, in the first chapters, I'm really reflecting on these sites of violence, and I write about it in a kind of metaphoric way, as if I had looked at these shards of broken glass and got entranced by that, all the play of images within it. And I realized that I had to step back more and look at the larger histories involved. And that's very much that came about through my conversations and this analytic dialogue that Khalil and I undertook in the book.
So Khalil, this method that Robert used stood out for me so clearly because you took a very different approach. And I was enchanted by your making transparent not just what you learned from your interlocutors in these hubs of migration and the hustle and bustle of the migrant city or the migrant Paris, but also the way you as an author become present, or an interrogator who's someone sometimes sent away, or sometimes people say, why do you want to know? Anyway, you're not going to change anything. So I can see you having these conversations. Can you tell us a little bit about your method, and also maybe also in some way, how this method and both of these methods come together to create a particular kind of tension or vision?
Mm-hmm. Well, one significant methodological choice that I made, and why I wanted to highlight in the writing the types of conversations I had with people, was that I decided to work on policing, on a specific police category that sort of coordinates policing and penal efforts in a specific neighborhood in Paris. So my interest at first was not in migration or in immigrants or in the cultural lives or social lives of immigrants, but it's in a way it's an ethnography of a state category in the way it becomes real and lived out on a territory. But the choice that I made was to not talk to police officers. And so this deliberate choice, and it's relevant in terms of phenomenology, that choice was because I was getting stopped and frisked by police officers. But I didn't have the conceptual or methodological tools to include that inside my research. And so I decided not to talk to police officers and to instead talk to shop owners, and to young men and boys who live out part of their sociability in public space. And so these two populations, shopkeepers and these young men, are the two main interlocutors of police officers, either as informants or through sort of surveillance and police officers inquiring on the activities in the neighborhood with shopkeepers, or as objects of suspicion. So that's and I try to convey that as much as possible inside the writing, because I found as a student that it was sometimes very difficult to understand what social scientists do and how they get access. And I wanted to show that access is something that's difficult to get, and it relies on a lot of refusal. And sometimes that refusal is not dramatic at all. It's just, well, I'm busy, get out of here. I don't want to talk to some young kid who's asking questions about the police. Please just, well, who are you? Who's funding this? And so I wanted to show that because I think it gives a lighter impression of what fieldwork can be, especially on these very serious matters. I think part of the things are, some of the writing is kind of funny in a way, where I'm being dismissed in a way that's heartwarming, I find. I don't know what you think. And in terms of engaging phenomenology and the difference in methods, what I was able to do in interacting with Robert was that what Robert did that was helpful for me was that he encouraged me to consider some of these embodied experiences that I had had, like being stopped and frisked by the police, to consider those as fieldwork through phenomenology. And so these low-key engagements, which were not that low-key, they were very intense, but they were not, I was unable to make that into sociological data, but I was able to engage it through phenomenological anthropology and consider that my affective relationship to this space and these embodied reactions that I was beginning to have in relation to the security apparatus I was studying were relevant for my analysis.
That's sort of interesting how you emphasize your body so much, because in reading the book I was very struck by the different positionalities that you and Robert had, that Robert in writing he's often refers to himself as a kind of a ghost or a spectre. He's constantly sort of evoking this sort of way in which he's almost haunting a field site, and yet your descriptions are so full of body, you know, like particularly the chapter in which you describe the various times that you were sort of held up by the police and the kind of humiliation and sort of assault that you experienced in those moments. And so, yeah, so this different subject position that you're writing from, it's so stark, and yet it seems to somehow work together. You know, Robert, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think you described it well. I think in some ways, looking back, I have this political entitlement to be a spectre, because I can slide in and out of these kind of social spaces and be on the margins, and I'm not marked in that way. I'm particularly marked when I try to speak French, because immediately people hear my accent and they position me in a certain way. But I can be more invisible in a way. You know, not completely, of course, but I'm not as noticed as much as certain, you know, persons in certain settings, particularly in say the 10th arrondissement. And so my body is more diffuse, I think, in those circumstances. I was certainly using my body as a tool, as a method to pick up on all these things that were happening, including this nervousness that was part of everyday life in Paris. But it's a different kind of modality. And with Khalil's writing, you know, I've used the book with students now, and they find that this is a very, very powerful passages where he's writing about his own, you know, their own experience with encounters with the police. And I remember we had discussions where you seemed to be hesitant, Khalil, to write these passages, and I was trying to be encouraging to bring that out more. And so I'm so glad you did as well.
Would you like to respond on this question?
Yeah, I think it's to move away from the personal, and because there's obviously something that's quite traumatic about these experiences, that there was a difficulty to put them into writing. But to move away from that personal level, I think there's also a disciplinary training that I had. And at the time I was trained in sociology. I was all about Bourdieu and habitus and hexis. And there was something about having to take these experiences and put them into writing and use them for analysis that did not fit within sociology. And I'm not sure if that's just a disciplinary sort of deformation in terms of how I was trained, or if it is indeed the way that discipline works. But I do think that Robert's perspective as an anthropologist is what made it possible for me to translate all of that raw emotional matter into something in the form of anthropological data.
Now that we are talking about discipline, I wanted to ask about the presence of history in this book, because for me it seems almost as if you're writing a genealogy of the now. Now, the now, and the violence in the moment is hyper-present in the book, but at the same time, it is layered before a long history of violence, and one almost sometimes gets dizzy thinking, like, where did this start? Is this colonialism? What about terrorism in this? And is the migration regime? This goes back to the migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea and potentially, dying already there or making it through. Or maybe they're on a passage to England. And then you wonder, why are these structural injustices there? And both of you encourage this kind of blurring of the vision that, almost brings different depth of history into view very briefly, and then they fade again. And I thought this was a wonderful way of doing anthropology plus a historical dimension. Is that a fair description? Or, maybe you want to comment a little bit on the the presence of the past in the now.
Exactly, right. And I think when I first started writing, I was focusing on the now. These months after the attacks, and through our work together, I focused more on the history of the now. And maybe a good metaphor that's come to mind recently, I don't think it's in the book itself, is that for both of us, there's it's almost like a lens, a photographic lens or a camera lens that focuses on very particular moments, very close up, and then pulls back and creates this larger historical genealogy for the kind of events and the histories involved, and then goes very close again, and then pulls back again. So very much this kind of oscillation of perspectives, and I think we're comfortable with that. And each chapter has that kind of zooming in on something and then pulling back. But I think that's been a shift in my own work to focus much more on the historical. And again, I think it came through our conversations. We would sit in cafes and talk about the kind of things we needed to account for. Mm-hmm. And that led to our writings, particularly in later chapters of the book on these historical dimensions of it. And we didn't want to write in a way that sort of causally explained the violence, these terrorist attacks, to say that, the poor conditions and quality of life of migrants cause people to act in this way. But we wanted to create a larger, intersecting histories, this palimpsest of violence, of inscription of violence and the erasure of it through going back centuries now in Europe and elsewhere.
I would add that I think there's the question of discipline and us progressively engaging with history from two disciplines that are focused on the now, the contemporary. And I think because we're progressively engaging with a different discipline towards the end of the book, it's a tentative engagement with history as a discipline. And so in that way, it's not necessarily as effective as the writing of a historian who's trained in history. And so I'm sure that there's a lot of historians who would read it and say, oh, that's preposterous. I think where we are really effective is that rather than highlight causal links between the attacks and policing and migration and colonialism, I think my intention was to explain the affective intensity of certain moments. And so this was all happening under the state of emergency. And to be able to understand why it was such a strong moment for a lot of my interlocutors who were of West African or North African descent, you necessarily have to go back to the birth of that state of emergency law, which is 1955 and in the middle of the Algerian War of Independence. And so rather than say, well, the security apparatus we have is directly inherited from there, I think one of the claims that we're making is that the reason why this is so meaningful for a lot of people is because it's directly tied back to that history. Whether or not it's a cause, whether or not it's rooted, grounded, or exclusively explained by is not so much our interest here, but it does explain some of the anthropological questions that we all have in this discipline of why do people feel a certain way? Why do people think in specific ways?
I would like to share with you what I thought was, for me personally, the most difficult part about this book. It was the immediate juxtaposition between the presence of the bombing and its aftermath and the eerie it causes, and the description of the violence of the migration regimes and the policing apparatus. And in some way, I want to be able to be angry because of both of these things, and at the same time, I know they are somehow related, and but I don't, so I feel myself forced to think about it, how they're related, and what it means, and how can I find an ethical position within this. And I couldn't find one. And for me, it was very painful to go through this, but I thought it's a good pain because, we have to kind of face up to the fact that, this is the violence we live in. And it's a violence that has these multiple faces. But I found it hard to kind of figure out what to do with that knowledge. How did this resonate for you, or what is the meaning for you to have this juxtaposition of these two ways of kind of or angers on violence?
Well, I think it's a difficult task, especially in we're speaking about it in Germany, decontextualized in English. It's a very nice sort of formal conversation. I think set back in the context in France, people were testing one another's allegiances. And so it was indeed very difficult to try to highlight a larger context of violence, remind people that this happened in the context of a war, that these terrorists claimed to be combatants in a war, and throughout the attacks yelled as they were shooting people, "Get out of Syria." It's a scary thing as a writer and as a researcher to engage that, because people then test your allegiances. Professors at the time were testing their students' allegiances in specific ways. And I'm not trying to explain terrorism. I'm not trying to make these links. What I do want to do, and I think the discomfort you felt is good too, because I felt it for sure. What I'm trying to highlight is that there's intense circulations of violence throughout Europe and outside Europe that need to be considered when we think of terrorism erupting within Europe. And I'm not talking about the symbolic and structural violence against migrants or asylum seekers, but I'm talking about the type of arms dealing that happens throughout Africa and in the Middle East and in Afghanistan, the type of circulation of violence between states rather than between folk, and I think it's a very tricky thing to do. But our intention here wasn't to fall into the trap of explaining away terrorism through a critique of France or French history, but rather to push for something that's a painful analysis, just to consider that perhaps we live in an extremely violent world, and perhaps we need to consider the ways in which that violence does circulate to and from our immediate, intimate, everyday contexts. And within the légèreté that Robert was interested in near the Carillon and near the sites of the attack, there's this apparent légèreté that's embedded in forms of urban and more spectral violence.
Robert, do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, just to sort of add to that. I don't think we feel that discomfort as well, and there is no direct connecting of the dots between the two. I would consider them two formations of violence, and they don't fit a single cognitive picture. There's a kind of impasse conceptually and morally in thinking about them. So I think you're identifying this uncomfortable moment in the material, but we didn't want to resolve it either and cure it in some ways. It's there in life, and I think that's what we're all speaking of as well.
Now, there's one thing I want to say about writing books, which, again, I thought was unique and intriguing the way you did it. When PhD candidates come back from the field, and I'm sure, you have similar tricks, I ask them, can they tell me anything that they didn't expect to find? And in which way have their notions changed? So what is kind of new in their sense of, how they're looking at the world? What did they absolutely not expect? And what maybe also did they, what, in which way does what they not expected make them think they didn't have the right topic or they didn't ask the right questions? But as they begin to write, I ask them to develop their voice, become confident authors, share their knowledge, make their argument clear. And in some way, I feel your book, both of you, managed to take away from confident authorship by allowing us to participate in the drama of learning. So it's not that you're not, sharing your knowledge and doing it very effectively, but you're doing it in a tentative way. And I feel almost as if I'm seeing different persons at the end of the book than I'm seeing at the beginning. So it's not just that you were transformed through writing the book, but you in some way become the actors, in this drama of an evolving author, kind of who knows more, after having written this book. Did you feel that's...
Yeah, I think that's a very perceptive. I think a lot of books, particularly in anthropology, there's almost like an all-knowing ethnographic voice that is going to communicate this very solid, confident knowledge. And I don't think either of us are taking that position. And maybe one way to think of it is that if you imagine novels where there's main characters and the transformations of consciousness and life that proceed through the course of the novel, I think that's a good analogy for what's embedded within this work. For me, it was about the transformation of my understanding of Paris. Like a lot of people, I found it a beautiful city and just like a kind of incredible place to live and to visit. And I think through this work, I got a better sense of the different, distribution of this beauty and violence within the city and getting a more comprehensive sense of what's involved in the contemporary moment, but these larger histories involved too. I think somewhere there's a sentence, something that goes something like, Paris is an apparition of beauty, ghosted by past horrors. And I think that's how I think of Paris now. So it's a transformation of my understanding, which is also a transformation of my personhood, my subjectivity as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
And did this also apply to you, Khalil, with the writing as a process of transformation?
Absolutely, but in obviously a very different way. It's through this writing that I began to find my voice, and that Robert was giving me the advice to be confident in the way you write. You know a lot of things. Sort of what Ursula just outlined is what the advice you give to your PhD candidates. And I resisted that a lot. I considered that I didn't have authority, and I didn't understand how authors actually functioned and what made them feel like they could write. And so I think I urged both of us to try to, nudge our way out of that confidence, so that we could produce writing that's more humble, but also aware of the complexity of what we were talking about, so that the claims we made were confident claims insofar as they were formulated with a lot of humility and a lot of caution. And I think the word that we actually used was disquiet. The things that we were talking about were so disquieting and shocking that being confident felt out of line. And there's something I would like to add too. Yes. I think in that way, as I was moving towards anthropology, I also engaged more and more authors, including Ruth Behar, who's sort of often quoted sentence, writing hurts. And I felt very, very close to that. that the writing process was painful, which was a great motivation to write more, but also to write more with disquiet and with caution and with respect in a way.
Okay, that's very interesting. So we've run out of time now. So I would like to thank all of you for this very interesting discussion of traces of violence. Robert Desjarlais, Ursula Rao, Khalil Habrih. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.